familiar with the trope of a Mary Sue character, a character who can do no wrong and is perfect at everything they try. And usually this trope applies to female characters, but we're going to see how it can apply to male characters as well. And and what we can do about it.
And if you aren't familiar with Mary Sue's, Anna will tell you about them.
We're going to talk all about it.
Yeah. But back to this week, talking about copyright in the public domain. I do want to start off by saying I am not a lawyer and I do not play one on TV. So none of this is official legal advice. If you are looking for legal advice, please seek out an actual lawyer. But this will help you get an introduction to the public domain and copyright and how that all works. So you have a better idea, but just know this does not constitute legal advice. I'm Daphne Strasser. I'm an editor with Tomeworks, an editing collective that is based out of Houston. I am also an author of a number of short stories, 4 short stories that have been published, as well as writing full-length novels that are romance, fantasy, science fiction. I am also a writer of fan fiction, and we're going to talk about fan fiction a little bit later and its relationship to copyright law. So let's get started. Copyright law and public domain are both aspects of an overarching concept called intellectual property. Intellectual property means that the things that you create, the things that you imagine and put down in a creative way, that those belong to you. And intellectual property rights protects the things that you create from others using them without your permission. There are multiple types of intellectual property, some that we're going to discuss today and some we're just going to leave alone. First one is trademark. This applies to logos, symbols, names, and slogans. Essentially anything that's really it's got to be short, and it's got to specifically apply to a company or entity that it represents. There's also patents. This is for things like machines, procedures, and plants, not the industrial kind, although maybe that too, but like the biological kind. You can patent a genetic code for a plant, which Monsanto is very good at. So patents are inventions, things that you have invented. Trade secrets are just that, they're secrets. This is a weird space. You do not have to declare what your trade secret is, as long as you are protecting it sufficiently for the law. Means like non-disclosure agreements and things like that. But this is, trade secrets are things that a company uses to get ahead of their competitors. So this is their processes or their data that they've collected, algorithms that they use, and recipes fall under this because recipes cannot be copyrighted or trademarked. They are free to use and therefore a trade secret. Which is why so many food companies keep them very closely guarded. And finally, what we're going to talk about today, which is copyright. That is books, movies, art, songs, plays, longer works of fiction and nonfiction. That's protected by copyright. As we go through this, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. We're going to be doing this a little informally. So you can save it to the end, or you can just say it now or pop it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. We ready to go? Okay. Next up, we have copyright, which is what I said, and what it is and how do we use it. Copyright is the exclusive legal right to print, publish, perform, film, or record literary, artistic, or musical materials, meaning you created it, it's yours to do what you want with, including sell it. Any original work is copyrighted by its creator from the moment it is produced. You do not have to register it. That means as soon as you write your novel down on your laptop, and putting it in an electronic form does count, as soon as you write your novel down on your laptop, it is copyrighted to you. You don't have to declare it to anyone. You don't have to say, hey, government, I wrote this in 2018. It's on your, it exists and it is on your laptop. It is your copyright. Copyright in the United States is something that you gain simply by having created your work. There's 2 important parts of this definition. The first is original. You produced the work by your own intellectual effort. This does not count copying something which is where copyright infringement comes in. You have to have made it yourself. The other is produced. Like I said, it must exist in a tangible form that includes electronic. The words must be down. You cannot copyright an idea that you told your friend over drinks at the bar. You had to have written it down. So then infringement. If someone is using your copyrighted work without your permission, because you can give people permission if they ask. Yeah, Anna, what's your question?
Hi, Daphne. I have a question about, so you said on the previous slide, your work is copyrighted to you if it's original, meaning produced by your own intellectual effort. So how does AI created work fall into this? And or like, you know, have there been any like lawsuits about AI generated writing? I know there have been some about AI generated art that has been determined to be not original. What about the writing side of that?
To my knowledge, this has not been tried. AI generated like a book or a play or something like that. There are no robust laws, and that's because of our law system is very slow and does not address modern problems. The technology runs ahead of the laws more often than not. So as far as I know, there are no specific laws or rulings that pertain to this. There are some theories on who it should belong to. So the creators of the AI system, the people who create the algorithm, will claim that it is theirs because it is their work on the algorithm, the AI program. It is their work that produced it. And then the people who are using the AI, the people who are putting in the prompts say, no, I generated it. I used your tool, which is publicly available, to generate art based on my own intellectual effort. I don't know of anyone who has actually fought this out in court because I don't think anyone's been successful enough with something to make it worth fighting for yet. Yeah. There's been no large scale, very successful book that was produced by AI for publishing companies to get tied up in with lawyers over it. And so, and I think that publishing companies in particular are going to be very wary of taking anything AI produced because they don't want to have to fight out that question. They don't want a judge to decide, no, actually the guy that wrote the program owns this book.
So I did do right
now. Yeah,
I did do the one on ChatGPT and the end of the human author. And essentially, if your book is more than 50% generated by AI, then the current theory, because you're right, it hasn't been litigated, but the current theory is that it is not copyrightable. ChatGPT or whoever, whatever AI program you're using, usually does not claim your produced work, especially if it is a work of fiction or something like that. They make no claim to ownership of that. But right now it is believed you can't either. That means you can produce it and publish it, but that other people could prospectively produce and publish your stuff as well, and that you can't do anything about it. So I think when we see litigation, it'll be along that front where somebody will say, well, this was AI generated, there's no ownership. That means that I can scalp your book and sell it with a different cover and you can't stop me. And I think that's probably going to be the first AI lawsuit that we're going to see. It hasn't happened yet.
Well, but again, it's going to have to be a book that was sufficiently popular.
Yeah, it'd be worth the cost of lawsuit.
And that's where the question is.
That's what they ruled on the art side of it, is that you cannot copyright AI generated art because it's generated from all of this intellectual property of other people, right? Because like all AI generated art comes from, is derived from art copyrighted by human artists. And it's the same way with the AI text programs, is all the text they generate is derived from text that's already copyrighted by other people. So
now what would be interesting, and we're going to talk about when copyright expires, but if someone made an AI that was trained entirely on public domain works, it could produce new public domain works. That's fascinating, but all right, let's go on. Infringement. What do you do when someone takes your work? So copyright infringement is when you use someone's work without their express permission, and it is hefty. You face civil and criminal penalties. I've listed them here, but the answer is, depending on what you infringed on, you could be in a lot of trouble. Like Disney in particular is well known for really going after copyright infringement, trademark abuse, things like that. So that's why you have to care about whether or not something is copyrighted before you start working with it. But there's some exceptions, as with everything. There are ways that you are allowed to use other people's copyrighted works. It is called the fair use doctrine. Just checking the chat real quick. Okay, so fair use is an acknowledgement that it is right and fair in our society to allow people to use copyrighted work within certain limitations. And these are the types of fair use. Criticism, comment, so those are going to be ones that's where parody comes in, very widely known as a form of fair use. News reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. So I am going to be using a number of copyrighted images in this slideshow, and that's okay because this is for educational purposes. I am not making money off of it. It's just for teaching you. But fair use is not like a really strict set of guidelines. It's actually just a way of determining whether or not something is allowed in individual cases. You can't like follow a checklist to make sure that you're never going to get tagged for copyright infringement, but it's still a fairly good guideline because this is what has been ruled before. So when a judge is considering a fair use case, if someone has or has not infringed on copyright, they consider a couple of things. What is the purpose of using it? For example, is it nonprofit or is it for profit? Because if it's nonprofit, then that's much more likely to fall on the fair use side. The nature of the copyrighted work, the amount of the portion used in relationship to the work as a whole. So how much of someone else's work did you use compared to how much is there? If I use 3/4 of the book Twilight to write a new book that's just Twilight with sex, that's copyright infringement because I'm using so much of it that my work would not be able to stand alone without the copyrighted work. And then finally, the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. If I am producing something that is not making me any money and is not actually taking away from the same audience of the original copyrighted work, then it's not real. It's like no harm, no foul. I didn't hurt your business by using your stuff. No one's coming to me instead of you, so I should be allowed a free pass on this. That is the argument. There is some questions in the chat. Jean asks, if you write something that is automatically copyrighted, how do you prove that you have the copyright? So this is going to, if someone is using your stuff, and you had the copyright on it, right? So let's say on your computer, the file was first opened and created on January 2nd, 2018. Your computer has an electronic record of it, and you can show that that existed. Now, if you were in a copyright trial, you also kind of have to show, one, that it's whatever they did was similar enough to your stuff to be indistinguishable or to be obviously copied. And two, that they had access to your work and were able to use it to create their own derivative of it. So here, that's where things can get tricky. And there have been a number of lawsuits surrounding things like this, where authors have similar ideas and they're published around the same time. And so there's some hurt feelings and there's some suspicion of, did you copy this? Did you take my idea? Did you make it into something slightly different and then use it? And so you have to be able to show that they were cognizant of your work, because if you had your book on your laptop, it might be copyrighted from like 1985, but if it's never left your laptop, it's not copyright infringement because no one had any access to it and had no way of knowing they were producing something similar to yours. Does that make sense, Jean? Answer your question? It's actually very easy to prove you have a copyright as long as you have any sort of history of your document. Okay, fair use. So we're all pretty familiar with things that would be considered fair use. SNL does a lot of fair use stuff. These are some examples of parody movies, which are considered fair use because they are commentary and are not like explicitly the same. So that brings us to the public domain. We've talked about things that are copyrighted. What about things that aren't? Some things are not copyrighted. They have either had their copyright expire or they never had one to begin with. And I know that I said that things are copyrighted as soon as you claimed them, but if you donate your copyright to the public domain, your work is no longer copyrighted. You do that very explicitly. It is not an accident to donate your work to the public domain. You have to explicitly say, I am donating this to the public domain for free use. There's like if you look up the Creative Commons has a number of things that you can say that would donate it officially to public use. Sorry. I think patents or intellectual property are another way too, not sure how that applies. We're going to talk a little bit about Disney in particular when it comes to trademarks, because we have to talk about Mickey Mouse. Because Mickey Mouse is about to go into the public domain. Everyone get really excited about that. All right, so if your copyright has expired or you donated it, then the work is in the public domain, which means that people can use it in whatever way they want without your permission whenever they feel like doing it. So they can literally just reprint the book and sell it. They can make money off of it. They can do nonprofit stuff with it, but it is public domain, so there is no control over what can happen with it. When does a copyright expire? The current law in the United States is that copyright expires 70 years after the creator's death. Currently, all materials that were created before 1927 are in the public domain. If something was created between 1927 and 1963, you're in a legal gray area because whether or not the copyright expired depends on if the owner renewed it. Before the Copyright Act of 1978, I believe, copyrights had to be renewed. You had to have an explicit copyright and it had to be renewed. After that act, or either that act or the 1993 act, copyright was created automatically when you created the work, and you did not have to do anything to renew it. So from 1927 to 1963, it's worth looking up if the copyright has expired or not. But everything before 1927 is currently good to go. So how do you know if something is public domain? You can look at the work itself and check for its copyright year, which will then you can, add however much to it. You can look in the US Copyright Office database. Now, I said you did not have to register your copyright, but you can. And it is helpful if you're going to publish something to have it already established with the US copyright in case you are dealing with cases of copyright infringement. You can look online. There are a number of websites that are dedicated to what is in the public domain, and they have little like release parties on January 1st every year for everything that just came into the public domain that year, which is a lot of fun. We get excited about what's going to be made public. You can also ask the creator if it is available for use. This is something that my brother-in-law did with his tattoos. He wanted a particular piece of art to be used as a tattoo, so he asked the creator if he was allowed to use it. If you reach out to the creator and ask, hey, did you put this in the public domain? And, depending on who they are, they'll respond, and that's the best way to know. If you do not know, if you cannot tell if a work is in public domain, the absolute best practice is to simply not use it. The repercussions, if you do copyright infringe the work, can be pretty big. So just play it safe. Examples. This is where things get fun. All right. These are things that are currently in the public domain. Some things have been in the public domain for a very long time. Some things are fairly new, like Winnie the Pooh came into the public domain just this year. You'll notice that these are things that there have been a lot of adaptations of. And there's a reason, because they're free to use. And so when you want to make fun movies or spin-off books, it's easy to use things that are already in the public domain. Specific example that I want to talk about is the works of H.P. Lovecraft. This is going to be the Cthulhu mythology. Currently, all works before 1927 are in the public domain, but ones that are after 1928, which includes the most famous ones, The Call of Cthulhu and At the Mountains of Madness, are a legal gray area because people actually don't know if the copyright was properly applied for or renewed. And so we're not sure if it's up for grabs, but
Can I ask you, how do we not know? Because it seems like there should be documentation, and maybe this is just too much nitty gritty to get into, but that seems weird to me.
So it has to do with, so these are legacy ones, right? So our copyright isn't 70 years after H.P. Lovecraft's death. It has to do with whether or not it was renewed. H.P. Lovecraft's stuff was published in fairly small magazines. Like at the time, like he's super famous now, but at the time he was complete nobody. And the works that were published were in fairly small, kind of poorly run fan magazines, for lack of a better word. And so the question is, did the publication apply to have the copyright renewed? And we're not sure. Okay. You'd think you would either know or not, but apparently we're not sure. So
okay, that's really interesting. Sorry to derail, because
no,
yeah, it's just like, was it published on this date? Was it not? We'll never know, because that magazine is gone forever. There are only 3 copies.
Right. But to the interesting part of it, which is Lovecraft himself, like, vehemently encouraged his followers to write within his world. He wanted people to lay claim to the mythology and to write with his characters and his settings and his monsters. He wanted that. He encouraged it. And so while there was no concept of explicitly donating something to the public domain, Lovecraft donated his works to the public domain. He wanted people to write with his stuff. And so that's where we are today, which is no one's really going to pursue you for going after Lovecraft. Like, it's even if you write something with Cthulhu or At the Mountains of Madness, no one's going to go for you because he didn't care. He wanted you to use it. All right, so I pulled some questions from various people, various friends of mine, as well as my own questions. So let's talk about frequently asked questions. And if you have a question, this is a good time to say it. All right. Can I copyright something based on the public domain? You absolutely can. You can do this. People do it all the time. But the underlying work will always still be in the public domain. Only the things that you add or change can be copyrighted. So, Pride and Prejudice in the public domain. Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies is copyrighted, but only the part where they added the zombies. You can have, there's so many Pride and Prejudice ones, but there's also a lot of adaptations of Peter Pan, for example, anything with Neverland. You can copyright the parts that you've created, but you cannot copyright the characters of Peter Pan or Captain Hook or Tinkerbell or Wendy, because those are all in the original work. Anyone can use them. So I said Pride and Prejudice. So for example, Pride and Prejudice, the book, absolutely in the public domain. Pride and Prejudice, the 2005 adaptation starring Keira Knightley, that you cannot copy. That is still under copyright law. Okay. Can I use, oh Jesus, my screen is not helpful. Can I use attributes that have been added to the public domain by another entity? No, you cannot. Those are what we just talked about, which is covered by the copyright of the adapted work. Great example. Winnie the Pooh came into the public domain this year. Winnie the Pooh, the book, came into the public domain this year. Just the first one, not the House at Pooh Corner. That we have another couple years for that. Winnie the Pooh, the first book, does not feature Tigger. Tigger is still copyrighted. So this year, when Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey came out, they could use Eeyore, Piglet, Rabbit, Kangaroo, Owl, and Winnie the Pooh, of course, Christopher Robin, but they could not use Tigger. They couldn't use him. They also could not use this iconic red shirt that Pooh is wearing, because that is a design of Disney. When Disney got the licensing for Winnie the Pooh and was able to create the movie, they created Pooh wearing this red shirt. That is an adaptation that Disney specifically did and cannot be used in future works because you would be infringing on their copyright of the character. Another good example, Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is such an interesting case because Sherlock Holmes is a series of stories. Go. Sorry, cat. Sherlock
Go,
Holmes
Sherlock, go. Sorry.
That's my cat. Sorry, it's Poe. Sherlock Holmes is a series of stories, and some of them have fallen into the public domain and some of them have not. The casebook of Sherlock Holmes is going to come out into the public domain next year, but most of the works are in the public domain at this point. In 2014, Leslie Klinger wanted to create an anthology of Sherlock Holmes stories, but she was being harassed by the estate of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And so she sued the estate, saying I should be allowed to make an anthology of Sherlock Holmes because the stories that he feature, or at least a number of stories that feature him, are in the public domain. Therefore, the character is in the public domain. That was her argument. The Conan Doyle estate came back and said, no, he's not a static character. He is a character who changes over time. Therefore, they argue, Sherlock Holmes does not enter the public domain until every story with him in it is in the public domain, which would have them hold on to the copyright for much longer. So what was decided? Well, the judge kind of didn't rule in favor of anybody. The judge said, well, the parts of him that are in the public domain, the stories that already exist in the public domain, those parts are public. The rest of it is not. So you end up with this weird split decision where certain character attributes of Sherlock Holmes are allowed to be adapted and others are not. So you can do John Watson, 221B Baker Street, Sherlock's deductive powers, because those are all already established in the public domain. But some things that haven't yet been released, for example, the fact that Sherlock did once work with a detective agency, as well as his emotionality, right, which is developed in later stories, that part's not allowed. So you end up with this restriction of you can make Sherlock Holmes, but you have to make him like an emotionless dick. But that was the ruling, and soon it's not going to matter because we will eventually have all of it in the public domain. But I found it a really interesting, weird case of copyright law where if you have a story that goes on for so long that parts of it come in and out of the public domain, that it can affect how people are allowed to deal with it. Can I prevent something from entering the public domain? This question specifically was asked about Lord of the Rings, if Lord of the Rings could be prevented from entering the public domain. The answer is no. In the United States, everything will enter public domain, and that's because it's written in the Constitution. Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. So in order for someone to hold a copyright in perpetuity, they would have to change the Constitution. Yes, Anna.
Okay, so I have follow-up questions about this, because so what about like renewing the copyright? Can whoever holds the copyright just not continually renew it and prevent it from expiring that way?
So as of 1993, we no longer have renewals of copyright. There is one single rule for copyright, and it is 70 years after the creator's death. It used to be that you were allowed to renew them. Now you can renew trademarks, and we're going to talk about how Disney uses this to get around copyright law in a minute. But yeah, you can renew trademarks. You cannot renew copyright anymore.
Okay. So I was wondering this question specifically because there was a thing that kind of blew up earlier this year about this guy who wrote Lord of the Rings fan fiction and was selling it on Amazon. And when it kind of blew up, he started to argue that he came up with the story of Lord of the Rings originally, and so it was his original work. And so he, I think, tried to sue like the Tolkien estate for the rights to, anyway, it was a big complicated thing, and I don't know exactly how it ended up.
That's
I was-
interesting since
Yeah.
The Hobbit was published in 1937. How old is he?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know.
That's quite a claim, and I would love to see him try to argue it, but it wouldn't work.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if it's all been resolved yet, but I was wondering about this specifically because of things like that, is like when Lord of the Rings enters the public domain, he could write Lord of the Rings fan fiction and sell it, and no one could say boo about it, except maybe.
For your information, just so you can get prepared, you have about 20 years before it expires. Lord of the Rings enters the public domain in 2044.
Yeah.
So if you want to spend the next 20 years creating some bang ass Lord of the Rings fan fiction to sell as soon as that copyright drops, please do.
I'll just take what I wrote when I was in middle school and just like make that way better.
You mean when Legolas falls in love with me, but so does Aragorn? 2044 is going to be a really interesting year. But we did talk about perpetual copyright, and that brings up Disney and Mickey Mouse. So for a very long time, no one cared about copyright. Honestly, in the pre-internet era, only people involved in publishing or movies cared about copyright. Once the internet happened, everybody cared. But before that, Mickey Mouse was created in 1929, something like that. I don't remember. Anyway, that's not right. It was before that because he's coming up on his 95th birthday. Anyway, Mickey Mouse was created sometime in the early 1900s and was a huge moneymaker for Disney. And so based on the current copyright of when he was created, which was the 1909 Act, was the one that held sway when he was created, he was quickly approaching a time where he would no longer be under copyright, and Disney got scared. So Disney spent a whole bunch of money in the 1970s to make sure that copyright law would be extended. So they lobbied Congress. They created a whole division of Disney that is specifically to lobby Congress. And they got the 1976 Copyright Act, which was nicknamed the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. They got that passed, which means that Mickey Mouse's copyright was then set to expire in 2003. Now, as 2003 started approaching, they once again got scared, and they're like, no, we really need to 1993. Yes, the 1993 Act. So he was set to expire sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s. And once again, Disney is like, we can't let that happen. So they lobby Congress again and get it extended once more. Now, obviously, the copyright is coming close to being expiring again now. But Disney has not put together a giant lobbying effort because they know it's fruitless. Because now that the internet has happened, there was all this piracy stuff going on, and then there became a movement toward the public domain and having how important it was for having things enter the public domain. Disney would be facing an absolute shit show of a battle if they tried to extend the copyright again this time. So they've changed plans. They're not going to try and extend the copyright on Mickey Mouse. Instead, what they've done is they've plastered Mickey Mouse everywhere. You see him everywhere right now. It's like they have this huge campaign to put his face in as many places as possible. And that's because they're establishing him as a trademark. They're saying that because you cannot separate the image of Mickey Mouse from Disney, which is 100% true, that he is still trademarked from Disney, which gives them broad powers to restrict his use. So even if you are trying to use Mickey Mouse in a allowed public domain way, you have to worry about the fact that you're still stepping on Disney's trademark, and they're going to use that to stop you. So it's really interesting. If you like, I encourage everyone to go look up the history of Disney and copyright because it's bloody and ridiculous, but also fascinating. But anyway, Mickey Mouse entering public domain, specifically Steamboat Willie entering public domain next year. But we talked about, I still want to talk about perpetual copyright because there is one single instance of perpetual copyright and it is in the United Kingdom and it features Peter Pan. Peter Pan was written by J.M. Barrie in 1908 as a play, later on creating a book. And to everyone's shock, in 1912, he gifted the copyright of this very successful character to the Great Ormond Street Hospital, the Gosh Hospital, which is Children's Hospital in London. So ever since then, the hospital has received royalties from Peter Pan, any works derived from Peter Pan. That copyright expired in 1987. And so a legislator put forward a piece of legislation that would allow the hospital to retain the copyright in perpetuity, with a few exceptions. It's only in the UK, so US adaptations don't have to pay anything. You only get royalties from it, and they only have the rights to the play. There was a legal battle over it in the early 90s, where the hospital tried to sue someone in the United States for using it, claiming they had rights to the character. And that just further restricted what rights to the character they had. So they've been kind of quiet about it since then. But companies, even Disney, will still send the hospital royalties as this kind of like token gesture. As part of his gifting the copyright to the hospital, Barrie said that they could not disclose the amount of money the hospital made off of this copyright. So no one's actually sure how much money they're making off of it, which is weird for a hospital for you not to know their finances that well. But we supposedly don't know how much money they make off of it. So Peter Pan retained, like someone still has an eternal right to the copyright of Peter Pan, which I find interesting. Oh, Anna, to your thing in the chat, Mickey has been trademarked before now, but they specifically are going after the Steamboat Willie version of Mickey right now. Okay, next question. Gotta check my time. Can I reference lyrics, quotes, characters' names, etc. from copyrighted works in my work? Yes, you can. This is fair use, and it reflects. So let's say you're writing a contemporary story, right? And someone says, "Who do you think I am, Harry Potter?" You're allowed to do that because Harry Potter is an existing part of our world that people would realistically reference. You're allowed to and especially because in this case, you're talking about names, lyrics, and quotes. Those are such relatively small pieces that you are adding into your story that are just taken from a much larger whole. So it's 100% allowed, as long as you don't try to pass it off as a creation of your own. So if you're going to quote Shakespeare and pretend that you wrote it, Shakespeare's public domain, that's less useful. If you're going to quote Britney Spears and claim that you wrote it, that's a problem. But if you're quoting Britney Spears as being Britney Spears, then that's no problem. Can I copyright something that I wrote anonymously? I was surprised to find out this answer, and the answer is yes. Anonymous copyrights have their own laws. They last for 95 years after publication or 120 years after creation, whichever one is longer. But it does raise a good question, which is who's going to enforce this? If you wrote something anonymously and someone uses it, you have to weigh whether or not you want to break your anonymity, prove that you own it, and enforce the law. So yes, you can copyright things anonymously. You have to be willing to go after them. Can I copyright a myth or a folktale? Whoever asked this question, I'm sorry, I wasn't quite sure what was meant by this, so I answered both. If you make up your own myth or folktale, yes, that is copyrighted, you created it. If you are using a common folktale, you are only copyrighting your adaptation of it. That's why we have Snow White and then all these knockoff Snow Whites. Because Snow White is a fairy tale, it's considered common knowledge, it's considered common property. But how you dress her, like, so you have the canonical thing, she's going to have dark hair, she's going to be really pale, she's going to have red lips. Those are all part of the original mythology, so you're allowed to use those. But the other parts of it, that's where it's dependent on your adaptation.
What about Grimm?
Grimm's fairy tales are in the public domain. Absolutely. So Cinderella, Rapunzel, those are all, no, Cinderella is not Grimm's fairy tales. Rapunzel is. Rapunzel,
Hansel and Gretel.
yeah, Hansel and Gretel, those are all public domain.
Oh,
What are the limits of using copyrighted work in fan fiction? Oh, I'm so glad you asked, because fan fiction is 100% copyright infringement. I am so sorry to tell you this. It is absolutely copyright infringement. There is no doubt in my mind. However, there are proponents of fan fiction, including myself, will argue that it is fair use for the following reasons. It is a transformation, so it is a commentary of is a transformation of the original work, therefore falling under commentary and, oh shoot, I don't remember the other one. It is generally not for profit. They will not make a defense of people using it for profit, but people who use it not for profit, they will argue that that is in their favor for fair use. And it's not taking away from the revenue of the original work. So if I am writing Marvel fan fiction, I am not making a single dent in Marvel's profits. In fact, I'm probably helping them because I am helping build the fan base that then makes them more money. That is the argument. Fan fiction is everywhere. And so from a legal standpoint, it would be extremely difficult for any company to try and go after individual fan writers because there are just so many of them. That does not mean people haven't tried, and we're going to talk about Anne Rice in a second. And Anna says in the chat, you're also not making money off of it. People are only reading fan fiction if they're already fans. They're consumers of the original work. Yes.
are you talking about the
however-
vampires?
Yeah, about vampires. We're going to talk about Anne Rice's vampires in a minute. But legally, this has never been settled. There has never been an actual court case brought forward addressing whether or not fans have a right to write fan fiction. It's simply a cross your fingers legal gray area. Archive of Our Own is there's a legal group behind it, and I am currently drawing a blank on what their name is. But Archive of Our Own is part of is a large fan fiction website, and they are part of a legal lobbying group that is trying to get fan fiction recognized as a legally protected form of expression. It's really interesting. You should definitely go check them out. I am a fan of fan fiction. I don't want anyone to think that I am not. I write fan fiction, but I take that legal risk onto myself because I do believe that it is copyright infringement.
So what does fan fiction look like? Are you writing a separate story, or are you just mentioning something?
You are using the person's setting and characters to write your own story in the universe. So it is heavily dependent upon the world that someone else created and copyrighted. Let's talk about Anne Rice. Anne Rice in 2001 got up all on her own and decided to go on a warpath. She posted the following message on her blog. I do not allow fan fiction. The characters are copyrighted. It upsets me terribly to even think about fan fiction with my characters. I advise my readers to write your own original stories with your own characters. It is absolutely essential that you respect my wishes. What followed was a scorched earth campaign. Anne Rice sent out a team of lawyers to go after fan fiction websites and fan authors themselves, in some cases doxing them on the internet. She had her work scrubbed from the internet and turned, and fan works for Anne Rice went completely underground, going just on password protected sites that you had to have a friend of a friend tell you how to get in, and mailing lists, email mailing lists, and so people who were writing and these are her fans, these are the people who love her stories, became completely disillusioned with her as a result of this. And this is coming to a head again because they have a new adaptation of The Interview with a Vampire. And naturally, a new generation of people is going to become fans. They're going to start trying to write fan fiction for it. And we're going to do this whole process all over again.
Is she
So it's
still alive?
possible. Sorry?
No, she's been dead for a while. She's been
Oh,
dead
has
for a little
she?
while.
I mean, but
Ye-
her estate can still go after it.
Correct.
Why did she do that? Does
Because
anybody
she didn't
know?
want it. And it's her right as an author to not want people to do it. That's fine. It's just you have to, as an author, understand that you're going to alienate your fans. She has every right to do this. I think it was dumb. Personally, it was not hurting her. It was an interesting way to
Why does it
flip off all of your fans.
why does it upset her terribly?
I can't answer that question.
All right.
Jean asks, if you write fan fiction and someone steals it and makes money, then the copyright owner sues. Can you benefit? This is fascinating because this became a problem last year, the year before. Someone was going onto AO3, stealing fan works and publishing them on Kindle for profit. Not the authors, stealing other people's work and publishing it for their own profit. And what happened was typically the authors would go to Kindle and they would say, this is a work of copyright infringement. Don't have to really specify that it's your copyrighted thing, but like legally fan fiction owners cannot own their works. That is what I have to say on that. But I know that sorry, again, I am not a lawyer. I personally believe legally fan fiction writers have no leg to stand on to try and own their works. But it's never been played out in a court. No one knows what would happen if we pulled this to court. If you steal someone's fan fiction and use it for your own profit, how many copyrights are you violating? Are you violating the fan fiction author's copyright as well as the original author's copyright? Can a fan fiction author even have a copyright of their adaptation? None of this has been addressed in the court.
That's interesting.
Anna AP rightfully says there is a history of works originally written as fan fiction being reworked and published as their own works. That is true. 50 Shades of Grey is probably the most popular example. Night Circus was also supposedly first written as fan fiction, but I'd have to check my sources on that one. So yeah, fan fiction. You take your own life in your hands when you write fan fiction. Nan asks, are there any economic studies of what would happen if there were no copyrights whatsoever? I don't know. I've never looked. That would be really interesting. I'm going to have to go look at that afterwards, but I don't know if anyone's ever looked into that. Okay, we've got a little time. Okay, so this brings us to why should you write in the public domain? And I am a big proponent of writing in the public domain. I think it's really interesting because you already have a built-in audience. It's like writing fan fiction, but for something you're allowed to write fan fiction for. You already have a built-in audience. It stretches your abilities as a writer to try and write someone else's style or to transform it in a meaningful way. And also it's fun. It's fun. Find something that you're a fan of and try writing something for it. It's a good time. But yeah, so do we have any other questions?
What does that mean, writing with the public domain?
It means to do a work, make something that is a derivative of a work that is in the public domain. So it is writing something based on something that no longer has copyrights.
You mean like the first generation of Star Trek?
The first generation of Star Trek is still copyrighted.
But if it weren't?
If it weren't, then yeah, you could do it, but it is still copyrighted. It's more like writing something based off Frankenstein, which is not copyrighted right now.
And that's allowed.
Yep.
So I have a question, and this might just be like really, really, really pedantic, but like, you know that Disney has created the iconic princess dresses and all that jazz, but say somebody else is writing in the public domain and they create a get up for Alice from Alice in Wonderland that is like bright red, and you've never heard of it, you've never seen it, and you decide that you're going to make your own adaptation of Alice at Wonderland where she's like a badass and whatever, but she has a bright red outfit. Can they come after you for that? If
They can certainly try, but
Okay.
part of copyright trials does mean what like intention matters is, I guess, the best way to put that. In these copyright trials, because there's been a number, especially with YA books in the past 10 years, that was really interesting, but there's been a number of them, and part of the trial is always, did you know? Because if you didn't know, then it's an original idea that you developed independently and is therefore your own copyright as well.
But like, is there anything to say? Well, okay, it's a red dress, right? So like, if it's not popular, is that copyright infringement? If you knew somebody else did it, but you weren't like attempting to take from the work, and that sounds kind of weird, but it's like, does the popularity of that impact this? And maybe I'm having a hard time seeing it because it is working with somebody's original IP that is now in the public domain. But it's like, okay, well, this other person did a red dress. That means I can never do a red dress.
No, I don't think it means you can never do a red dress. And unfortunately, I think that popularity does matter in this case, because the red dress actually falls kind of more into like a trademark, because it's going to have to do with the recognizability of it.
Does it matter what shade of red it is?
I can't answer that.
That's why I was like, maybe I should have said this might be too legal because it would be so situation specific.
No, I think your intentionality matters, and I think your exposure to it matters. And so I think that if you can make a reasonable case of, I never saw that, and if I did, it didn't seem important, you could get off with that. But it doesn't mean they won't come after you.
Gotcha.
If you use a different shade, maybe you could say it's not the same color.
Yep, you could probably make that argument. CC.
Hey there. I just wanted to say to you, I do a lot of Zooms by lawyers on these subjects, whether it's music, art, and writing. And I think you've done a really excellent and thorough job of presenting this. So I wanted
thank
to
you.
thank you. You're welcome.
All right. Anyone else before we wrap up?
Thank you.
Thank you.